Imagine a world where power wasn't loud, where leadership didn't shout to be heard, where authority didn't rely on fear, intimidation, or dominance, where influence wasn't measured by how much space someone could take up in a room. Imagine a world guided not by who speaks the most, but by who understands the most. A world where listening carried more weight than posturing, where insight mattered more than image, where decisions were shaped by awareness, not ego. What if INFJs ran the world? Not from the shadows, not quietly observing from the sidelines, but actively shaping systems, policies, priorities, and values. What would change? Would the world slow down? Or would it finally begin to make sense? Stay with this. Because if the INFJ personality type shaped society, the world would feel fundamentally different. Not perfect, not free from conflict, but deeply intentional. INFJs would redefine power. If INFJs ran the world, power would no longer be measured by control. It wouldn't be about dominance over others. It wouldn't be about forcing compliance. It wouldn't be about hierarchy existing simply to maintain itself. INFJs experience power as responsibility. The responsibility to protect those with less voice. The responsibility to listen before acting. The responsibility to consider how decisions ripple outward over time. Power, to an INFJ, is not permission to take. It is an obligation to care. Leadership would feel quieter in this world. Less performative. Less reactive. But it would feel more grounded. Decisions wouldn't be made to impress. They wouldn't be rushed to satisfy public pressure. They wouldn't be driven by optics alone. They would be made slowly, thoughtfully, with an awareness of long-term impact. INFJs do not think in headlines. They think in decades. INFJs would build systems around human well-being. An INFJ-led world would not reduce people to statistics. Productivity would not override humanity. Efficiency would not be valued more than emotional health. Progress would not require quiet suffering. Work systems would be designed with the nervous system in mind. Burnout would be seen as a warning, not a badge of honor. Rest would be recognized as a requirement, not a weakness. Education would prioritize meaning over memorization, curiosity over compliance, understanding over competition. Healthcare would focus on prevention, emotional context, and long-term well-being, not only emergency response. INFJs understand something many systems forget. People function best when they feel safe, not pressured, not threatened, not constantly evaluated, but understood. Safety, to an INFJ, is not indulgence. It is the foundation of human potential. INFJs would slow the pace of life. If INFJs ran the world, everything would slow down. Not out of laziness. Not out of resistance to growth. But out of wisdom. Decisions would be made after reflection, not urgency. Policies would be tested for ethical impact, not just economic gain. Innovation would be evaluated for human cost, not just speed. INFJs understand that speed without direction leads to collapse. That constant acceleration disconnects people from meaning. That urgency, when chronic, erodes clarity. They value sustainability over constant expansion, depth over volume, stability over spectacle. In an INFJ-shaped world, the pace of life would soften. And in that slowing, people would finally have room to breathe. INFJs would center decisions on long-term consequences. INFJs are naturally future-oriented. They don't just ask, "Does this work right now?" They ask, "What does this create later? What happens 5 years from now? 10 years from now? What emotional, psychological, and social cost will this decision quietly accumulate?" They think in patterns, in trajectories, in cause and effect. In an INFJ-run world, short-term gain would rarely win over long-term integrity. Quick profit would not outweigh lasting damage. Temporary comfort would not justify permanent harm. INFJs do not chase outcomes. They protect trajectories. They care less about winning today, and more about what kind of world that win produces tomorrow. INFJs would redefine success. Success would no longer be measured by excess. Not by how much someone owns. Not by how much power they accumulate. Not by how visible or influential they appear. Instead, success would look like alignment. Are people fulfilled? Do their lives feel meaningful? Are communities connected rather than divided? Do systems support dignity rather than erode it? INFJs believe success without meaning is empty. Achievement without integrity feels hollow to them. Growth without purpose feels disorienting. So society would slowly shift toward purpose-driven living. Work would serve life, not replace it. Achievement would support well-being, not consume it. Success would feel quieter, but more real. INFJs would reduce conflict by addressing root causes. INFJs do not ignore tension. They sense it early. They feel it beneath the surface. And they know it never disappears on its own. Rather than suppressing conflict, they would investigate it. They would ask what emotional need is being unmet. What fear is driving behavior? What wound is being expressed indirectly? Rather than punishing symptoms, they would address underlying causes. Because INFJs understand that unresolved pain repeats itself. It resurfaces in different forms, different generations, different systems. So conflict resolution would become proactive, not reactive. Less about winning arguments, more about restoring balance. Less about blame, more about understanding. And in that shift, much of the world's noise would begin to quiet. INFJs would protect the vulnerable. If INFJs ran the world, vulnerability would never be treated as weakness. It would be recognized as a signal that protection is needed, that care is required, that power must be used gently, not forcefully. INFJs are instinctively attuned to those who exist at the edges of society. Not the loud, not the dominant, but the overlooked. Children whose voices are dismissed. Elders whose value is reduced to what they can no longer produce. Communities pushed aside because they are inconvenient to acknowledge. Individuals who suffer quietly because drawing attention feels unsafe. INFJs notice the quiet suffering first. They sense emotional neglect before it becomes visible harm. They feel systemic injustice before it reaches crisis. They recognize pain that has learned to stay silent. So policies would not only respond to disasters, they would prevent them. Support systems would be built before collapse. Protection would be proactive, not reactive. Care would be integrated, not conditional. Because INFJs understand something fundamental. The true measure of a society is not how it treats the powerful, but how it safeguards those without power. INFJs would value depth over noise. An INFJ-led world would not be addicted to stimulation. There would be less pressure to constantly consume, less urgency to always respond, less glorification of speed, volume, and visibility. Noise would no longer be mistaken for importance. Instead, depth would be honored. Quiet spaces would exist not as luxury, but as necessity. Places where people can think without interruption, feel without explanation, reflect without justification. Introversion would no longer need defending. Solitude would be seen as restorative, not antisocial. Silence would be understood as presence, not absence. INFJs know that the most meaningful insights rarely arrive in chaos. They arrive in stillness. In this world, people would no longer need to perform constantly to prove relevance. Depth would speak for itself. INFJs would encourage authenticity over conformity. INFJs do not believe that harmony comes from sameness. They understand that forcing people into identical roles creates quiet resentment and inner fragmentation. So individuality would be protected. Education would focus on discovering natural inclinations, not correcting differences. Children would be guided toward what energizes them, not pressured to abandon it. Work environments would adapt to temperament, rather than demanding everyone function the same way. Creativity would not be treated as a distraction. It would be recognized as contribution. INFJs understand that when people are allowed to be themselves, they offer more of their best. Authenticity creates engagement. Conformity creates compliance. And compliance is fragile. A society built on authenticity becomes resilient, because people feel connected to who they are and what they offer. INFJs would make ethics non-negotiable. In an INFJ-shaped world, ethics would not be flexible. They would not shift based on convenience. They would not bend under pressure. They would not disappear when profit is involved. Integrity would be foundational. Every system would be examined through a moral lens. Who does this help? Who does this harm? What are the unseen consequences? INFJs cannot separate success from ethics. Because misalignment creates internal unrest. They feel it physically, emotionally, psychologically. So decisions that compromise human dignity would feel unacceptable, regardless of gain. Transparency would be valued over image, honesty over efficiency, responsibility over reputation. In this world, shortcuts that erode trust would not survive long. Because INFJs know that once trust is damaged, everything becomes unstable. INFJs would design leadership that serves, not dominates. Leadership, under INFJ influence, would feel different. It would not rely on fear to maintain order. It would not demand obedience through intimidation. It would not equate authority with superiority. Instead, leadership would feel grounding. INFJs lead through understanding. They listen before they act. They integrate multiple perspectives. They hold complexity without rushing to simplify. Leaders would be measured by how safe people feel around them, by how clearly they communicate, by how responsibly they use influence. Power would not feel threatening. It would feel stabilizing. Those in leadership would be accountable not only for outcomes, but for emotional impact. Because INFJs understand that people follow best when they feel respected, not controlled. INFJs would normalize emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence would be treated as essential literacy, not optional, not secondary, not soft. INFJs understand that most conflict does not come from bad intentions, but from emotional unawareness. So education would include emotional skills from an early age. Children would learn how to identify feelings, how to communicate needs, how to manage frustration without harm. Workplaces would value emotional clarity alongside competence. Leadership would require self-awareness. Communication would prioritize understanding over dominance. Emotional intelligence would be seen as strength, because it prevents damage before it occurs. INFJs know that unrecognized emotions drive decisions quietly and destructively. Awareness brings choice. INFJs would create a world that feels safe to be human. Ultimately, if INFJs ran the world, life would feel less hostile. People would not need to armor themselves constantly. Sensitivity would not be mocked. Depth would not be dismissed. Reflection would not be rushed. There would be room to be uncertain, room to be thoughtful, room to be imperfect. The world would not become ideal. Pain would still exist. Challenges would remain. But the environment would feel intentional. And intention changes how people move through life. When people feel safe, they open instead of defend. They collaborate instead of compete. They heal instead of harden. If you are an INFJ, this vision isn't random. If this world feels familiar to you, it's because it mirrors your inner values. Your discomfort with the current pace of society is not weakness, it's awareness. INFJs don't seek control. They seek coherence. They don't crave dominance. They crave harmony. And while INFJs may never sit at the top of global power structures, they influence the world in quieter ways. Through thoughtful conversations. Through value-driven decisions. Through moments of understanding that ripple outward. INFJs reshape the world. Not by force, but by meaning.